Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our event today. My name is Amy Bailey, and I'm the Director for Sustainability and Engagement at C2ES, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. C2ES is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that works to secure a safe and stable climate by accelerating the global transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions and advancing a thriving, just, and resilient economy. We work with policymakers at every level and leading businesses to accelerate climate progress. We're pleased today to welcome you to the Alliance for Sustainable Futures webinar on tackling flood resilience. If this is your first introduction to the Alliance for Sustainable Future, welcome. The Alliance is a joint initiative between C2ES and the US Conference of Mayors. Our two organizations have worked together for a number of years in partnership with key corporate members like AECOM to provide a platform for the public and private sectors to accelerate climate action and sustainable development. Mayors have long seen the direct impacts that our changing climate can have on their communities, and with more frequent and intense precipitation events, flooding is increasingly disastrous climate challenge for US communities. The recent action by Congress via the 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and this year's Inflation Reduction Act, along with exciting new efforts by the Biden-Harris administration, are bolstering existing resources to communities and providing new ones so that they can better prepare. So we're delighted to host today's webinar to share some best practices with you and also share updates about some of the tools and resources that are available to communities. We're pleased particularly to have with us today the Mayor of Dubuque, Iowa, Brad Cavanagh, who is a champion for ambitious climate resilience at the local level. And before I turn it over to my counterpart, Judy Shahan at the US Conference of Mayors, I would like to cover just a few quick housekeeping items. First, we will be recording this webinar. A recording will be made available on C2ES's YouTube page within 24 hours, and we'll also be sharing it with the Conference of Mayors. If you need any assistance during the webinar, please just email webinar@c2es.org. The format for today's webinar will be a keynote introduction by the mayor, followed by two panel discussions. The mayor is going to kick us off with a brief introduction of Dubuque's story of building flood resilience and then introduce his team to share more details about the city's approach and lessons learned. And then we'll have a few minutes for audience Q&A before we turn to our second panel that focuses on the federal resources from NOAA, EPA, and other agencies that can help communities increase their resilience. We will close out the webinar today with a quick discussion and Q&A session with all of our panelists. So on that last point, we do have some time for audience Q&A after each panel, and you can submit your questions into the Q&A portion of Zoom. So we'll try our best to answer them. We do have a packed agenda, so please just make sure you're sending them in so we can see them as we go. With that, let me turn things over to my colleague at the US Conference of Mayors, Assistant Executive Director Judy Shahan.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'm very excited that we could present this webinar today. As Amy mentioned, one of the Alliance's goals is to share best practices that other communities and businesses can replicate themselves. We have produced 5 of these best practices reports. And with the assistance of AECOM, we released the most recent report in January that not only featured best practices, but also identified all the resources that were included in the bipartisan infrastructure law that could be utilized to assist communities with their sustainability and climate efforts. A link to that report is available in the chat. I encourage you to download it and check out the best practices and resources that are available to you. One of the case studies we featured in our most recent report is Dubuque's approach to handling their flood problem. I was made aware over many years that Dubuque was facing flooding issues way too often and how they developed a comprehensive and multi-year approach with a wide variety of funding sources to fix this problem. And so I was very anxious to be able to highlight Dubuque's story and to share to have them share their story so other, unfortunately, so many cities are facing that similar problems and they could learn from this best practice. And so I was pleased when I approached the mayor back in June, and he and his staff volunteered and were more than willing to share with us their experience with us. And with that, I'd like to turn this program over to the mayor of Dubuque, Brad Cavanagh. Mayor, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Judy, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. So glad you're able to join us here today. I am Brad Cavanagh, and I serve as the mayor in Dubuque, Iowa. We are right where Illinois and Wisconsin come together and touch Iowa right there. We're right on the Mississippi River. It's just a beautiful town with towering bluffs, and we really do love it here. And I'm excited to be here today to highlight the work that our city has done on flood mitigation and resilience, particularly with our B Branch Watershed Flood Mitigation Project. So before we begin, I want to make sure I thank the Alliance for a Sustainable Future and AECOM for their great work in highlighting Dubuque as a best practice case study in their most recent report. And I also want to thank C2ES and the United States Conference of Mayors for hosting this webinar and for the longstanding commitment in working toward climate smart solutions. So with that, I'll ask my teammate Darren here to start up our PowerPoint so we can walk through the presentation with you. We want to talk to you today about a way in which Dubuque has creatively built infrastructure that has prepared us for true sustainability with real impacts on our economic and social well-being as climate challenges increase in severity and frequency. So as Darren moves into the second slide there, I want to set the stage for us because I think it's important that we try to put ourselves in the shoes of where Dubuque was at a certain point in time. So imagine for a moment dark clouds forming over your neighborhood where you live. And then imagine the fear that shoots through you every single time that happens, because you know that sometime within the next hour, you're going to be standing in feet of water in your basement like you have so many times before. Next slide, please, Darren. So for years, this was the reality in Dubuque. For thousands of our residents on the north end, from 1999 to 2011, Dubuque experienced 6 presidential disaster declarations and way too many scenes like the ones you see here on the screen. Next slide, please, Darren. So the flash flooding that resulted from unprecedented rain events caused severe damage to homes and businesses, as well as public and private infrastructure in some of the city's most challenged neighborhoods and where 50% of Dubuque residents live and work. So one more slide here, please, Darren. So it wasn't long before our community started to speak up and demand solutions, and the city of Dubuque listened. So today, we want to tell you the story about what our city did and how we did it. So joining me to do this today is a team from the city of Dubuque staff who was absolutely instrumental in this work over the years. So first off, we have Darren Meering, our civil engineer. Also joining us is Alexis Steger, our housing and community development director. And then finally, Terry Goodman, our Director of Strategic Partnerships. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darren to tell the next part of the story.
Thank you, Mayor. Talking about planning and engineering. And as the mayor mentioned, this is, 50% of our citizens either live and work in this watershed, and it's about a quarter of the size of our entire corporate limits is where the watershed exists. And why the watershed is important is because it's the most important thing for us was to work holistically and to work on the watershed level, which is another effort that the whole state of Iowa has undertaken as part of the Iowa watershed approach. But one of the first things that we really worked for us was to plan our work, and don't think of a problem as too big. You really need to dive into them and figure out what's going on. And so in terms of stormwater management, flooding, flood mitigation, look at the watershed instead of, more of a piecemeal approach, but to develop a plan. And then, as the mayor mentioned, 6 times over a 12-year period, after we kind of developed our plan, we had these intense rainstorms that resulted in flash flooding and presidential disasters. And so just to kind of give an example, as engineers, when we design stormwater management facilities, historically, there's a built-in cost benefit kind of approach where if you design your major system for what's the 100-year rainstorm, that's usually the benchmark. And, you can't afford to protect against every situation. And so that was what kind of the standard was. So the 100-year rainstorm, or it's the storm that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And so when we started looking at our watershed approach, we relied on Huff and Engel's work that actually was partially funded by NOAA, but that just indicates how much rain we can expect for that 100-year rainstorm. And from 1992 and while we were designing this, that was about 6.36 inches of rain in a 24-hour period of time. And in 2013, and again, after many of those rainstorms that were mentioned, when all that new data is taken into consideration from 1992 to 2013, that you can see those numbers increase. And so when we were designing for the 100-year in say 2000, as you can see here, the new number is that'd be a 50-year storm. And so that wouldn't, designing for the then 100, we wouldn't get the benefit we wanted when we initially set out. And then what's going to happen in the future? And, just looking at the last 50 years of rainfall data in Dubuque, again, based on the information from NOAA, it's like a 21% increase per decade. I'm sorry, like a 1.4 inch increase per decade, which if that continues, that would be up to a 21% increase by 2027 or 2070 over the next 50 years. And so again, you look at what that would mean is, okay, if we're designing for the 100-year today, in 50 years, that's approaching actually be less than the 50-year potentially. So that's kind of what we're dealing with in terms of designing these systems, and why resiliency is so important, because you just want to be prepared for whatever happens in the future. And so one of the things is, don't change the plan, not the goal. So just because things change, you can always adapt. And so what we did is we updated and amended our plan. And in 2013 had a drainage basin master plan amendment. And that's really what came about, was all of our improvements related to this watershed project. And I've given talks about this, and when someone says, what is the B Branch watershed project? So one of the things I've talked about before, well, it's the flood mitigation and resiliency, stormwater treatment, habitat creation, neighborhood revitalization, community engagement, transportation enhancement, tourist attractions so citizens can sleep at night project. And the reason I say that is because it's way more than just a flood mitigation project. And as you can see, it provides multiple benefits and multiple different angles. So one of the things, all the colors shown here in this watershed, is just zooming in on the watershed, are different practices that we're implementing or improvements. So things like pervious surface reduction, pervious surface reduction, green alleys. And one of the things, when you're going through your project, is figuring out, well, in terms of federal or even state level participation or partnerships, is, you have to understand, well, who does this interest? And so that's one of the things that we realize, in addition to flood mitigation in our situation, this also has water quality benefits, by filtering the water as it goes through the ground. We also created upstream detention to impact the rate of runoff. And again, who would be interested in the preservation or enhancement of riparian landscapes and prairie grass and pollinator habitat? So again, looking at who does this interest for possible partners as far as, implementing your project. And then our creek project itself, again, it doesn't, in addition to the beavers who really loved eating our new trees, who does this project interest? Well, quite frankly, a lot of different organizations at the local, state, and federal level. And really what we're doing, the important is to have your plan in place, or have a plan so that when opportunities come around, that you are ready for them, so that you are ready to apply for, when a new program comes out from the state or the federal level, you've got almost everything done. It's just a matter of copying and pasting into the application form, or renaming your project a little bit to fit the narrative that you're going for. And so just to recap here, so these are all the funding sources that we were able to include in our towards all these projects. And so these listed right here in gold are just the ones that could be considered environmentally or environmental improvements. So that's like 16.9 million in related to environmental improvements or habitat creation or what have you. If we look at disaster resiliency, about 140 million, with the prime ones being the state flood mitigation program, but then also the HUD CDBG disaster resiliency grant as prime examples. And then recreation and tourism. So almost, over $3 million in and programs that are really for recreation and tourism, but they add to our project. So we're creating a flood mitigation project, but what else can we do with this project? What other programs can we take advantage to enhance what we're doing? I mean, because as a city, you're not building something in a vacuum. You are creating something that's going to be going through neighborhoods. People are going to be living next to this, experiencing it. It's going to involve utility relocation. So that all these things you have to consider as a city. And so understanding what other enhancements can go along with just addressing flood mitigation. Even transportation assistance. So almost $8 million, $7.5 million for that. Again, the Federal Highway Administration doesn't really concern itself with flood mitigation, but it does concern itself with alternative forms of transportation. And so there are programs that we tapped into for like our trail system that goes through along the creek that we recreated, that we were able to take advantage of to again enhance our project. And so again, all told, for a project that's estimated to be about $250 million, and a project that's going to take us, well, we're 20 years on right now, another maybe 20 years to fully complete all the green alleys. You know, we've been able to secure partnership funding in almost $170 million worth. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alexis to talk a little bit more about the financing challenges.
Thank you, Darren. So as I was smiling, as Darren was going through all of the financing that we put together for the Bee Ranch Watershed Project, because it highlights some of the difficulties that we worked through with so many funding agencies and ways to fund a project. Next slide, Darren. We had to blend some of the regulations for each one of those funding sources and make it a sustainable model for us to even meet the regulations. So for example, a very typical NEPA and Section 108 for the National Historic Preservation Act require you to do certain things to prove that you're not going to affect the environment in a negative way. And if you are, there's some mitigating things that you can do. Unfortunately, each agency has a different way of meeting those requirements. So they want you to submit into their system specifically, or they want their form, and all of them are meeting the same requirement under the federal law, but became very not sustainable. So as you go forward with finding all these other funding sources, it was reaching out to each funding source and saying, we are meeting NEPA requirements, just like the EPA. Can we submit what we submitted for the other federal agency? And you can accept that in a different way. So finding those hurdles and jumping over them, we found that the federal agencies, they wanted that too. Our state agencies actually wanted to work hand in hand to combine all these funding sources to make a successful project. So when you see the barrier to maybe a funding source and you think, I can't meet that requirement, you know, reach out. That was one of the main things we continued to do throughout the project, was reach out to see if they're willing and able to make those funding sources work together. We got yes as the answer almost every single time. These agencies want that project to work. Now, did it take several months to get the right person? Yes. So don't give up when they say no. Find the next person. Terry will talk a little bit about how many times we went up to the state capitol, how many times we had to put a comma into legislation to make sure that it included our project. So that's just one of the main things to think about when you have a project. If you think that won't work because I don't have enough people to meet all these regulations, you actually probably can, and you just need to reach out and ask. Next slide, Darren. So another example of that is we had found in SRF opportunities that there's something called a sponsorship project. No one had used it throughout. It is a federal program, and no one had used this sponsorship project carve out, in which you can actually refinance your SRF loans and make some of it forgivable to use in some green infrastructure. So basically, if you have a standard loan and you're paying on that loan, and you refinance to a lesser amount of interest, you can use the rest of that money that you're saving to go towards the project that you need. So just getting creative and finding things that hadn't been used, even though they're in the legislation, is another way to try to start funding projects that are a little bit unique. You know, the the funding agencies want you to use it, and maybe they just didn't know those rules existed or didn't have a plan yet to use them. And you can help them develop that plan to use it for your project. Next slide, Darren. So I was in charge of doing all of tracking all the financing and all the legislation, and then I switched to my current position in housing. And we found a very unique way to make a flood mitigation project also about homes. And that is very unique. Mostly infrastructure is a focus, and we sometimes forget that private residents can't always recover from flooding events. So all of the times that they had furnaces inundated with water, they no longer work. So coming up with unique solutions was also something our funding partners really like. Coming up with ways that's resilient in that not just infrastructure, but human resiliency as well. And so these are some of the examples that we went into homes with about $8 million, homes that have been flooded over and over and over again, and elevated their furnaces and water heaters. The infrastructure stopped the all of the excessive flooding in the basement, but just in case there is some water intrusion, let's get them off the ground so it doesn't happen again. Let's get those furnaces working. Let's get the danger out of the homes, the mold and things that had happened over time. So it was something extremely unique brought to the table for our funding partners, and they really like that idea. The biggest thing to be ready for is that they're going to want to see the outcomes. So always tracking your data and making sure that you have the ability to do that up front. So as Darren talked about on the planning stages, make sure you're planning to keep track of all your data. How did you affect people? How did you change the environment? And then how did you also build that social resilience? And that can really help you find funding to make a project work, and tell your residents, tell your stakeholders how it actually did work. And we're in that phase now, and it is actually really fun for us, having worked through it for several years, to get to that point. And I will now turn it over to Terry Goodman.
Thanks, Alexis and Darren, and thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today to talk about this exciting project. I have one slide, and it's really 3 slides. It's building relationships, building relationships, building relationships. City of Dubuque has a mantra, and that is people, planning, and partnerships. Everything the city undertakes is in partnership with some other organization or some federal or state agency. And so we know that, there's an old saying, that if you're not at the table, you're most likely going to find yourself on the menu. And so while it's not just self-serving to have these relationships, it is important because our federal and state officials are our partners. We travel to Des Moines not only to maintain relationships with our elected officials in the State House, but also to visit with and communicate with state officials, oftentimes who find themselves managing federal funds that flow through the state, like CDBG and other funds. So we maintain relationships at the state level. In Washington, we travel to Washington once a year. With our mayor and city council and community partners, business partners, to renew our relationships with elected officials in Washington, but also with their staff. And we also meet with federal agency staff and officials to maintain relationships there too. All of this has been going on for more than 20 years. It started before the B branch, but it was of immeasurable importance to this project. The one thing, again, I'd like you to take away from this brief presentation that I have is maintain and develop those relationships, never stop those relationships. And number 2, when we talk about ecosystem services, and we talk about those multiple benefits. We've been asking folks in Washington for years to try to come up with a benefit cost analysis that takes into consideration the green infrastructure benefits or the multiple benefits of ecosystem services. This project, as you can see from some of the funding sources that Darren highlighted, is magnificent. We had the choice of putting, I think, 4 new culverts underground and taking down homes, and just putting new culverts in. The confluence here is as the B branches with the Mississippi River. But instead, the city council chose to create this linear park that stretches from the Mississippi River a mile into some of our most challenged neighborhoods and most affordable housing stock in town. The improvements are, again, those multiple benefits, but it also allowed the city staff to explore with our partners at the federal and state level, the different agency grants and opportunities that presented themselves. So you can see we were able to benefit from Interior Department in trails and DOT and conservation grants with the DOT, with CDBG, as Alexis pointed out. We were able to get both infrastructure money from DOT or from HUD, but also the funds to improve homes that were inundated for decades. So we benefited from those departments, and also obviously EPA and EDA disaster mitigation grants. Other resources and sources of funds I have to mention is the state flood mitigation program. And you can look this up. It's replicable. We don't know why other states who have sales tax don't necessarily look at this as a resource. Iowa Code Section 418, but it allows communities to benefit from a certain percentage of their sales tax and bring it back to the community, and take the sales tax benefit and plow it into a flood mitigation project. What was interesting, again, in terms of a partnership story, we knew the legislation for flood mitigation was being written by our colleagues in Cedar Rapids after the 2010 flood. Many of you may recall that flood. It was devastating. And they wrote the legislation and said, if you've received FEMA funds, or if you've received funds from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, you can participate in this program. Well, that basically would have left out, I think, every city in the state at that point, except Cedar Rapids. So we asked them to amend it to say, or funds emanating from the Clean Water Act, and Darren and Alexis and I were involved in that. They accepted that as an amendment, and what happened then was that every city in the state of Iowa could potentially benefit from this flood mitigation project. And for the state of Iowa, that's important because we have a lot of water. And so that's where partnership came into play. I cannot tell you how important these relationships are, and how thinking creatively about the multiple benefits of projects is, and understand that, you know, many of these people that we work with every day in Washington, in Des Moines, and in our own community are not just work relationships. They become our friends, and they are also helpful in identifying funds for these important projects that provide for the lives, health, and safety of our citizens. So that's what I'm going to leave you with today. We're very grateful for this opportunity to share our story.
Great. Thank you so much. It's, you know, such a wealth of knowledge this team has, and a lot of really strategic steps that you've taken over many years to make this happen. And we're getting some really good questions, but I do want to stay on time. So we'll just do all of our discussion and Q&A after this next panel. As Judy mentioned at the outset, really our hope with this conversation is to provide all of our attendees with some new ideas about how communities can prepare for flood events. And a major component of that is accessing federal resources. So that's what our second panel today will focus on. Federal resources take many forms: information, decision tools, technical analysis, and of course, funding, which we've already been talking a lot about today. And these resources really come from a number of federal agencies. So over the past several years, as I mentioned earlier, the federal landscape has changed quite a bit. So today we are pleased to have with us Co Barrett, the Senior Advisor for Climate at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Zach Schaefer, the Senior Advisor at EPA's Office of Water, and Bill Abel, the Vice President for Energy at AECOM. I'm going to turn it over to these panelists now, and we will go in that order: Co, Zach, and Bill. And once they've shared their remarks, we're going to pull together all of our speakers and have kind of a fuller conversation. So please keep those questions coming. We've got a lot of good ones to pull from.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Thanks to everybody for having us. This is a fabulous conversation. It's so interesting to see the details on the Dubuque activity. Very inspiring, guys. So in my brief comments, I'm going to share a few ways that NOAA is seeking to assist you in your efforts to adapt to a changing climate. But first, let me stress a change that we're seeing with recent extremes. Flooding from the sky, basically, due to heavy precip events, either as standalone events or with hurricanes. And, I have a dual role because I'm a vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And those assessment reports show that since the 1950s, extreme rainfall events are indeed happening more frequently, especially in the eastern US, but all across the nation. And the trend is only expected to continue in future warming scenarios. In just the past month, the nation has experienced over 40 deaths and devastating impacts from historic rainfall events in St. Louis, Eastern Kentucky, Colorado, Death Valley, Dallas, Mississippi, all while extreme drought covers 20% of the nation. So mitigation and climate planning is very much a topic to be attentive to. For those who are not very familiar with NOAA, let me just say we house the National Weather Service. We put climate and weather satellites into operation, and we are a leading provider of climate data and services in the federal government. We sit within the Department of Commerce, not intuitive for some folks, and we work with a range of partners from other federal agencies to local municipalities to ensure that folks have the observations, the data, and the climate predictions needed to make decisions with the best understanding of our current and future climate. So climate services are NOAA's bread and butter. And with that in mind, we have recently launched an initiative we're calling the Climate Ready Nation Initiative to build resilience across the US to climate risks and hazardous weather. Initially, we're targeting extreme heat, wildfires, and drought, and two areas pertinent to today's conversation, floods and coastal protection. From where we sit, honestly, we see a growing need to evaluate and adapt to the ongoing impacts of extreme weather, water, and climate events, especially flooding. So let me talk about a few things we have underway. With regard to inland flooding, we're putting money from the bipartisan infrastructure law to work, updating resources that directly support community resilience, such as NOAA's precipitation estimates. We received about $500 million for flood and inundation forecasting. In Darren's presentation, you saw a mention of NOAA's Atlas 14 product. Atlas 14 is the authoritative federal source for precipitation frequency estimates used for watershed planning and design of all built infrastructure. And it's also used to assess the severity of extreme precipitation events. And we have heard, believe me, we have heard loud and clear the requests from city planners and flood professionals to update these precip frequency estimates nationally. The estimates for Dubuque, for example, were last updated 10 years ago, and a lot has changed. Further, Atlas 14 doesn't take into account future climate. It assumes a static climate, so we have to update these to incorporate future planning for climate change. Next, I want to just quickly highlight that we have a new National Water Center in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. It's a center of excellence for water resources, science, information, and prediction services. It's the first in the world facility that enables NOAA and other federal partners to deliver a new generation of water information and services to the nation. These new services will strengthen the nation's water forecast capabilities for floods and droughts, improve preparedness for water-related disasters, and inform high-value water decisions at the local, state, and national levels. And we work with local emergency managers and state and federal partners to ensure this information is available and usable by communities. For folks who are from coastal states, I also want to highlight some of our coastal flooding resources. Earlier this year, NOAA released a report on sea level rise projections through 2150 for all US coastal waters. For the first time, we also produced an application guide to help communities use the scientific findings to plan for coastal flooding and sea level rise in places they care about. We're also working with partners like the Association of State Floodplain Managers to ensure that our resources like digital coast tools and trainings are relevant and actionable and addressing the needs of communities. So for example, the Digital Coast Sea Level Rise Viewer helped Jackson County, Mississippi, determine the safest place for the relocation of their wastewater plants, avoiding a potential $2.2 million in hurricane and storm surge related damages during the next storm season. So I don't have time to go into all of our capabilities in great depth, so apologize for this short teaser of information. I'll just close by saying that we provide local support to communities through our university-based Sea Grant offices, our weather and river forecast offices across the country, regional climate centers, regional integrated research activities, and they cover practically the entire US, especially coastal areas, including the Great Lakes. So I highly recommend reaching out to your local office to find out about this work. And with that, I look forward to our discussion and turn this over to Zach.
Thanks, Ko. I always love seeing all the great work going on at NOAA, and as one of the data consumers at EPA, we always appreciate the incredible wealth of information and analysis that NOAA is producing in this area, and that then we're able to use and help our stakeholders in states and communities use to address a lot of these challenges. So thanks for having me and EPA here. I'm Zach Schaefer. I'm a senior advisor to Assistant Administrator Fox, the AA for Water here at EPA. And we're excited to be talking about climate, and we're excited to be able to talk about all the resources that we have at EPA, particularly through Bill, although those aren't the only resources, but through the bipartisan infrastructure law to help address solutions, including flooding, sea level rise, and other precipitation and climate related challenges. So I just wanted to give a very quick overview of sort of the resources through the bill that EPA receives, knowing that this is, well, significant and the largest investment in water infrastructure in our nation's history, is only one piece of a larger federal family effort to bring resources to bear to address these challenges. And that spans from EPA to NOAA to FEMA to HUD to DOT and so many other agencies who have funding and equities in thinking about how to manage stormwater, how to build and plan communities in smarter ways, and how to tie and fit these resources together to help communities stack them, like you saw in the Dubuque example. So at EPA, the bill appropriates nearly $50 billion to the Office of Water to fund a range of programs to build drinking water and clean water infrastructure, as well as our place-based programs. That's primarily through our clean water and drinking water SRFs. In particular, there's nearly $12 billion in additional funding on top of annual appropriations through the Clean Water SRF, which has a range of very important flexibilities for issues like green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, flood control, and the kind of planning that communities need to do for sea level rise. We also receive nearly $2 billion for protecting regional waters through our geographic programs, our National Estuary Program, and the Gulf of Mexico Hypoxia Program. These are resources through longstanding programs in particular areas of the country, most of them coastal, but a significant, actually the largest pot of GEO funds go to the Great Lakes, but to address particular concerns, but many of them are very climate adaptation and resilience focused. It's preserving, protecting, and restoring the ecological and the integrity and the health of ecological systems and the communities that rely on them and are adjacent to them. And these are very powerful programs, both from the perspective of leveraging resources, including the resources you see here to tie in other federal funds and non-federal sources of funding, but also as partnership hosts, that these are programs that work closely on the ground in communities with local government, with state government, with partner agencies like NOAA, like FEMA, like DOT, and provide a lot of connective tissue. And so you can learn more about these programs on our website, and we'll include resources and links through the host to make sure that you can find out more about them. But to the extent that you have one of these programs in your area, and these do span the coasts of the country, Atlantic, Pacific, Gulf, Puerto Rico, and the Great Lakes, these are incredibly powerful programs, and we encourage you to take a look at them. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. So just to stay on the SRF for a moment, though, as made evident by the Dubuque project, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is such a powerful federal state partnership to invest in clean water and stormwater infrastructure. As I mentioned, the bill appropriates nearly $12 billion to this program on top of regular annual appropriations. And importantly, there are a wide range of eligible uses and types of projects, which are not just ways to address flooding, but to build infrastructure that can serve multiple community goals, like building green space in nature-deprived communities, like achieving greenhouse gas mitigation co-benefits through nature-based solutions. And we really encourage communities and water systems who are thinking about their funds to think about these multiple benefits, and to think about the creative ways that these funds can be used to achieve a lot of different goals that that states, cities, communities are setting for themselves. So our SRF implementation memo, which we released earlier this year, specifically encourages states to fund projects that foster resilience to all threats and hazards. So that's both there's an intersection, of course, between man-made hazards and threats like cyber attacks, and resilience challenges posed by climate change. We are really urging states and communities to support and apply for projects that invest in climate adaptation. And we're also encouraging states and communities to drive toward energy efficient and climate smart water systems. So, we know that water is so frequently the medium through which communities experience climate change, but also have an opportunity to help fight climate change through one water solutions, through energy efficiency, through renewable energy generation on site, and other tools. So just in sum on the SRFs, the Clean Water SRF should be a key tool in your toolbox to fund stormwater infrastructure. And I encourage you to contact your state's Clean Water SRF program to learn more about how to apply. One additional important thing about the SRFs is the way that they work with other programs across the federal family. There's frequently projects that are co-funded through both the SRFs and USDA's Rural Utilities Service, for example, or there's an MOU between EPA and FEMA that allows communities after a disaster declaration to use SRF funds, which are usually readily available in states' coffers and can be deployed quickly for disaster mitigation and response, and then be reimbursed through FEMA's BRIC program afterwards as that funding becomes available, but to help use the SRFs to help accelerate post-disaster response. Although, of course, we always want to do what we can ahead of time to deploy pre-disaster mitigation solutions. I'm also going to note the federal flood risk management standard. At EPA, we're taking steps as a part of a whole of government effort to ensure that we not only help communities build and upgrade infrastructure, but that when we do, it's there to last for generations. The last thing we want to do is help you build a new drinking water treatment facility or wastewater treatment plant, only to see it inundated and damaged or destroyed by an extreme weather event in a few years. So that's why all SRF projects, whether it's for stormwater, wastewater, or drinking water infrastructure, now have to incorporate the federal flood risk management standard into their design. And our memo to states released this March lays out, or this April lays out requirements and flexibilities to comply, like building outside the 500-year floodplain, or at least 2 feet above base flood elevation, et cetera. Then last, if we can go to that last slide, just wanted to give some examples of some of the resources we have available to help communities and water systems plan and assess their climate risks and vulnerabilities. Our CREW program, Creating Resilient Water Utilities, is a great program to access both the tools that we have through our website, as well as the more tailored, hand-held, one-on-one technical assistance that they can offer to many communities. We're also standing up resources here at EPA through the bill to provide support at every stage for helping communities assess their needs and vulnerabilities and options for funding, as well as helping write SRF applications and supporting them through engagement, design, and planning and construction management to help communities who've never applied for these funds or who might not have all of the technical or financial or managerial expertise on hand have all the tools that they need to set themselves up for success when applying to the SRFs in their respective states. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me or the SRF contacts on our website to learn more about that. And with that, I think I've gone over my time, so I will turn it over to Bill and look forward to answering any questions in the discussion.
Thanks, Zach. ACOM's had the privilege of working with C2S and the Conference of Mayors over the last few years, documenting city best practices on climate action, sustainability, and resilience. The most recent report that's the subject of today's webinar builds on the earlier work and focuses specifically on how those best practices can be used and applied to take advantage and tap into the unprecedented amount of dollars that are available through the Infrastructure Act that now are even more significant with the Inflation Reduction Act. Those best practices, including Dubuque's, provide a lot of kind of key lessons learned that we want to follow. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about, or particularly about financial resources, but I think a couple of the other presenters on both panels pointed out pretty clearly that resources aren't just about getting money. Any technical analysis or support that you'd otherwise have to pay for that the government will provide or another partner will provide is incredibly valuable, particularly in the initial scoping of your project. You know, Dubuque pointed that out clearly that they had used it. You know, Zach pointed out the use of NOAA information. That early technical analysis is sometimes the easiest partnerships to get and can be at a real advantage to you. But let's talk about what some of those best practices were. We, across every one of those case studies, there were several that stuck out. The first, and it was pointed out in Dubuque's, the most successful start with a plan to meet a critical community need before they chase money. Each one of them identify multiple and diverse community benefits that can be achieved through their projects. That builds a stake within the community and a reason for the community or grant recipient to invest in the first place. All of that identification of benefit and development of plans is characterized by significant community engagement. And that requirement of community engagement and community impact is really front and center in the new federal legislation. They use their plan and their benefits as a roadmap. It was a roadmap to go out and find partners. And they were really careful about matching funding opportunities with identified needs. And I think as you found out from Dubuque, they really thought broadly about it. It wasn't just about flooding, it was about housing, it included transportation. It was everything from green infrastructure and the benefits associated with it to emergency response. Not just at the beginning in the plan, but throughout. Every one of the best practices engaged diverse stakeholders early and often. They didn't stop talking. They kept on talking and revising and asking for help. And they used their plans and their efforts and their alignment with their funding partners to establish common goals with the funders. In many ways, your community plan and your community priorities and benefits you're trying to deliver can be your strings attached. They're what you're driving to. But you got to remember, every one of the funders, anybody who's going to support you, has a mission of their own, and they need to get in alignment. And I think particularly with the new federal legislation, because it has a broad, not just climate and resilience context, it has a broad community context and a broad equity context, creates some real opportunity for engagement that hasn't really existed before. I think those best practices were really eloquently described by the mayor and his team. As they pointed out, the project was driven by a critical priority and plan driven by community input. Their plan put skin in the game first and included a commitment to invest and to lead. It provided a compelling story of partnership that leveraged significant resources. You know, for example, in Dubuque's case, they used federal funds from 8 separate funding programs across 5 different agencies. And they used 4 different, they had the same experience at the state level, where 4 different agencies and funding programs were involved. So now let's talk about the new opportunity and what's available. Next slide, please. I think what you could take from a lot of the discussion, though, is there's a lot of complexity, both in solving these problems, but also in securing partnerships. There's over 400 funding programs across 2,600 pages in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And there are even going to be more opportunities that exist within the Inflation Reduction Act. At AECOM, to help manage through that complexity, we actually use a bot, right? So the search around keywords. This is just an example of how we go about it, but I think it's also the kind of things that you need to challenge your municipal and government staffs to do. And when engaging with partners, you need them to help you work through. You know, we ran a relatively simple green infrastructure program. So we used one idea, green infrastructure. And in using our tool, we were able to identify, you know, of the 400 funding programs, at least 60 quality matches specific to green infrastructure, and 3 verified matches. But again, keep in mind from the conversation and presentations, the presenters didn't just talk about green infrastructure. They talked about flooding and critical infrastructure protection. They talked about cyber risk and energy efficiency. They talked about transportation. So there are multiple opportunities. So think broadly in your plan, not just what you need to do, but what funders would be willing to fund, and then talk directly to those agencies about which programs can do that, which programs specifically are about housing, because we got a housing flooding problem, which one's about economic development. So plan well, but engage early with your partners. It's an unprecedented opportunity, and hopefully the case studies can give you some specific examples that you can follow as well. And now I think Amy is going to facilitate some Q&A.
Thank you. And great comments from all of these panelists. And I want to just make 2 notes to everyone on the call today. You know, if there are more details that you'd like to find on those funding sources and the project components that are in the Dubuque example, please see that case study document that we've linked to in the chat. There's a lot of great information and details in there. And just as a reminder, we are going to make a recording of this webinar available after we're all done. It will be on the C2ES YouTube page and the Conference of Mayors website. I have a couple, I actually have a lot of questions, but we'll get to just a couple, I think. First, I want to ask this question of, you know, how do we really address the idea that the climate impacts are going to continue changing, right? So to the Dubuque team, can you expand a little bit more about how you're approaching this idea that, you know, these 50-year storms are going to come more often, and, you know, how do you build that into your design and, you know, investment process? And then to the federal resources and folks on the call, you know, what's your favorite resource that's available to communities that really helps them think through the climate projection piece of all of this?
So I'll answer on behalf of Dubuque. I think as an engineer and planning side, like for example, the B Branch Creek, we designed for a statistical 500-year event. Again, just that's the way we built in the resiliency, the flood mitigation aspect, because we, you know, will it continue to increase going into the future? You know, the recent trend seems to indicate that, but whether it does or it doesn't, we'll be ready for it, because that's what we're kind of designing our facility to meet.
Darren, I just wanted to add to that. There's so many aspects of the project that we can't go into right now, but the upland detention halfway across town, because this is a watershed that includes half of our community. And then also the expanded detention areas and basins and wetlands that we enhanced are other parts of that. So, I think the whole point is to try to, through green infrastructure, absorb as much water before it runs downhill into these lower neighborhoods right next to the Mississippi River.
Great, thank you. Co, I'm wondering if you have anything to share on your favorite resource that communities should go to first when they're thinking about kind of what the trajectory is for different climate impact.
Yeah, thanks. I was trying to be respectful of Dubuque, but yes, I'm very excited. NOAA houses a very easy to remember URL, a website. It's climate.gov. And it has tremendous number of resources, not just from NOAA, but across federal agencies. So that can be used for a broad range of applications. But in particular, there is something called the Climate Resilience Toolkit that has the steps to resilience that are tremendously helpful for helping folks, get into the kind of planning for the future. So I'll just offer that up.
Great, thank you. This is a question for the Dubuque team. Can you share a little bit more about how you might have worked with private businesses and, whether they're the large or small ones there in town? What has their role been? How have you continued to engage them kind of from start to finish and even the outcome phase?
Darren, can you talk a little bit about the businesses that were in the watershed and in the floodplain directly of the B branch and how we negotiated deconstruction of homes and businesses, et cetera? I mean, I think that's the first encounter we had in addition to the neighborhood meetings.
Yeah, I think one of the first things is getting people involved, but making sure you're getting a full cross section of the community. So having your local business leaders, small businesses, large businesses at the table when you're talking about funding, when you're talking about what the actual improvements are and where they're going to be built, that's really important. And we made sure that we tried to involve them early on. I think that's the major thing we tried to do. And then, I guess one of the things when it talks of property acquisitions, we early on didn't have federal funding or state funding in our project, but we made the conscious decision to follow the Federal Uniform Relocation Act when dealing with businesses or homeowners. Again, one, it's the right thing to do, treat everyone fairly and uniformly, but also then if we were able to secure some federal funding in the future, which we were lucky enough to do, then you don't have to scramble and figure out how you acquired properties may or may not have impacted that eligibility.
And the only other grant that, the direct need for business to, sign affidavits, et cetera, was the EDA disaster mitigation grant. And of course, there is a floodplain, or there is a small business park that's that's directly impacted by flooding in this particular part of town. And they were very cooperative and extremely eager to help us because they were impacted by flooding, and so were their employees in these neighborhoods.
And just real quick, we did have a fundraising campaign as part of our project for one of our grants, and we have private companies, organizations that are investing in our amenities in our facility as well.
I forgot to mention that, Darren. So businesses and individuals can pay for trees or benches, and there are larger amenities like overlooks on some of the water features, and there are bridges that can be named. And so we have a community fund drive, so folks are able to give a tax benefit gift to the project as well as benefit from all the federal funds and taxpayer funds that have gone into it.
Oh, I love that. That's a great way to get the community really excited about the project and bring them down to the water and see it as well. So I think that's really a cool step. Well, we are at time, and I'm sure we could have talked for hours more about the Bee Branch Creek project and all of the different federal resources that are now available. But I do want to be kind of cognizant of everyone's busy schedule. So I want to thank everyone that has made some time today to talk to our audience. We'll be excited to kind of keep this conversation going however we can and follow up with some folks over email with a few more responses to some questions that have come through. And if there's any other additional questions, just let us know and we'll do our best to address them. So thank you all to our speakers, and we look forward to working with you again.
Thank you.
Thank you all.